everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around I'm coming to you from the Chobe River here in Botswana, and I'm on a pangolin boat here. I want to thank Pangolin Photo Safaris for allowing me to borrow their boat to do this quick little review. And this is my thoughts, my field impressions, I guess, of the A9 Mark III and the 300mm Sony f2.8. Now, the A9 is going to be a little bit more involved, and I'm going to give you some of my, kind of as a bonus at the end, I'm going to give you some impressions of this 300mm f2.8 because it was really a surprise for me. You'll find out here in a little bit. But first, I also want to thank Procam, who helped me get this stuff right before my trip. They really came through for me. Thank you, George at Procam, for setting me up with this. So let's start talking about the A9 Mark III. Now, this is probably one of the ultimate action cameras on the planet right now, but is it appropriate for wildlife photography? That's the big question. And I've put it to the test here for the last 2 weeks. We just finished up a workshop and I've been using this camera on my own. It's been really, really great. So let's start with ergonomics and then we'll kind of work our way through, and I'll tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly about this particular camera. So first, ergonomics. And it is different than a Sony A1. That's the one I'm used to. I realize that some of the features and ergonomics on this camera have been implemented in other Sony cameras, but in this case, I'm comparing it directly to the A1. I notice the buttons are a little bit more raised. I find they are easier to find when my eye is to the viewfinder, and all of them are like that, especially the C1, C2 buttons, and even some of the buttons on the back here seem like they have a little higher profile than what we had with the A1. We also have a totally customizable ring over here where we used to have exposure compensation. Spoiler alert, I've left exposure compensation on it. I really like that feature. One thing I don't like though is that this turns a little easier than the old exposure compensation dial on the A1, and I find that sometimes it's easy to roll. I realize it has the little lock button at the top, but unfortunately, the little lock button is kind of an inconvenience because I want to be able to just reach and grab it. I don't want to be pressing extra buttons. So a couple other things I like about this is the grip is a little more comfortable than the A1. It feels like it's a little better situated, and I feel like I have a little bit more room between my fingers and the lens. I also like this new little feature here, at least new to me, coming from an A1, this little asterisk that's on the drive modes that allows you to change your drive modes via the menu, or in my case, I put them on a toggle with the joystick. I just press this and I can go from one frame rate to another very rapidly instead of looking away from the camera and coming up here. So ergonomically, this is a vast improvement. The other thing I really like about this camera is this amazing little flip screen right here. When I pull this out, I can use it as a traditional flip screen. And I have been doing that as I'm kind of leaning down on the boat and trying to get low level shots. But you can also flip it vertical like so, which is really, really nice, very easy. And you can turn it around. It has all sorts of possibilities. You can keep the back of it out so it's protected when you're traveling. So this little flip screen has really been a surprise to me. I've been very happy with how well it's worked out.
Okay, so I was shooting that video unscripted. I've left out a few things. I'm going to patch them in here as we go. I hope you don't mind. And the first thing I left out was maybe the most important thing is the new C5 button, and it's right here on the camera. Hopefully you can see it right there. I'll give you a close-up of that as well. And that's a super handy button. You can program it for a lot of things, but I actually have it on kind of what Sony intended, which is the continuous speed boost. And basically what that means is I have it on a toggle. And if I press that button, I'll go from whatever my current frame rate is to 120 frames per second. So that's what I have that one set for. I don't have 120 frames per second on my normal drive modes. Those are 60 at high plus, 30 at high, and then 20 is just the medium, and at low I have 10 frames per second. And as I said, I toggle through those using the joystick press, so that's all very, very handy. I really like this option because I kind of use it in combination a lot of times with pre-capture. So maybe I'm out there, I spot a small fast bird, and I go ahead and tap pre-capture, which is C4, and then I tap this one, which is C5, and then I am ready to go at 120 frames per second with pre-capture. So that's really, really great. And when I'm done, I can just tap them again. My eye never needs to leave the viewfinder if I don't want to. But I did find that incredibly useful on my trip. So hopefully that's maybe something you can take away from this video if you're thinking of getting one of these cameras. Let's continue.
Now, of course, the reason you're buying an A9 Mark III is not because you're in love with the ergonomics. Sure, they're nice, but you're buying it for action, right? And that's where this global shutter, 120 frames per second option comes in, as well as this new and improved AF system in this camera. Very, very impressive. Let's go over one by one. So let's start with frame rate. We're talking 120 frames per second. This is basically the speed that we use for slow-mo in movies, right? So this is a really, really fast camera, and it basically allows you, when you're doing a fast animal, to get just about every single wing position. So it's really nice. It can be very granular. You can go in and get that exact moment that you want. I've used it for wing positions. One place I've used it is when you have a bird flipping a fish in the air. You can get that moment when that fish is right between the beak much easier with this than you can with something that's relatively slower, but still pretty fast at 20 frames a second. Sometimes at 20 frames a second, you maybe have one shot and the fish is a little low, the fish is a little high. With this, you get all of those in between shots. Really, really something. Is it something I use every day? No. A lot of times I have this set to 60 frames a second if I'm doing some faster action, or more likely if I'm just doing normal stuff with it, I'd be at 30 or 20. However, one thing I've learned with this camera, and we're going to talk about this as we go, is that this is really for action. This is the one I'm using for action. I find that the A1 is actually better suited for other things. So there are some caveats though with those really extraordinarily fast frame rates, right? So the first is your buffer. It's going to fill really, really fast. At 120 frames a second, your buffer is going to fill in about a second. At least that's what I've been experiencing with this camera. At 60 frames a second, you're going to be at about 2 seconds to a full buffer. So if you're using those really fast frame rates and you have a prolonged action sequence, it can turn into a problem. And I've had that happen multiple times where I'm at a really fast frame rate and suddenly the camera's choking at just that kind of perfect moment when you really don't want it to choke. So you have to be careful how and when you select those frame rates. Only select them if you really need them. Now at 30 frames a second, you're back to a much more respectable, just about 8 seconds or so worth of buffer. And if you go to 20 frames a second, it goes like 22 seconds or something like that. So it really lasts a long time when you get into more reasonable frame rates. But again, it's an action camera, so you're probably going to want to shoot it fast. So that's something to consider. Now, if you use pre-capture, which works really well, along with your high frame rate, that can really impact your buffer too, because you're going to be feeding all of those pre-capture images into the camera and then continuing to shoot. So this is really going to impact your buffer if you're using pre-capture. In fact, if you're at 120 frames per second and you're using a longer pre-capture rate, I use 0.03 seconds, but if you're using a half second or even a full second, heck, if you're using a full second, your buffer is going to pretty much be full as soon as you press the shutter. So you have to be very careful with the length of time that you're using that pre-capture for, and you only want to use pre-capture if you really need it. So that way you have the maximum amount of buffer available. A lot of people use pre-capture for everything, and it's not really meant for that. It's meant for those moments like this Malachi kingfisher right here, where you have a very, very fast subject and it's almost impossible to notice him taking off, press the shutter, and get the shot before it's all over with. Pre-capture has come in very, very handy though out here when I'm dealing with smaller birds like that, and it's definitely something I use with bee eaters. I've gotten some really great stuff again with this with these Malachi kingfishers. So something that you can definitely use if you're looking for a very small, fast bird in flight, some kind of scenario like that. Or even if you have like a bird, again, flipping a fish in the air. This is a very common thing around the water. And sometimes when they're flipping that fish up, you know, they're doing it so fast that it's very hard to keep up. So sometimes I'll turn on pre-capture and I'll just take those little bursts as I see them flipping it. And I've gotten a lot more kind of fish between the beak shots because of it. So pre-capture is definitely a plus on this. But again, I keep it at 0.3 seconds. That seems pretty good. If you're really quick on the trigger, you can probably go 0.2 seconds, but I definitely would not go over 0.5 seconds on it because it's really going to have such a negative impact on the buffer.
Just another note with pre-capture here, because sometimes it lets you catch things that you just couldn't catch otherwise. Now, in this particular case, I had this little Malachi kingfisher, and I had noticed as I was trying to take them in flight that it seemed like by the time I could react to them flying off their perch, the bird was already out of the frame. Now, I was using pre-capture, so I was getting them. However, I got curious about it, so I looked it up, and it turns out the average human takes about 0.25 seconds to respond to visual stimuli. So in other words, it takes a quarter of a second by the time you see the bird and can actually press that trigger and get the shot. Well, this guy was out of the viewfinder in 20 frames, which at 120 frames per second works out to 0.167 seconds. So he's literally out of the frame faster than my nervous system could respond to him taking off from that perch. So that's a great place for pre-capture. That's where this thing really comes in handy. Now, I realize, I know I'm going to get some dissent here in the comments saying, well, I've gotten shots like that before without pre-capture. I realize that. But often, I know when I've gotten those shots in the past, it's because the bird gave a lot of indication it was about to go. It wasn't just a quick burst. or that I was already shooting static portraits of him and he happened to take off. In this case, basically I was waiting for him to fly, and when he did, I pressed the shutter release, and thanks to pre-capture I was able to get them.
Next, let's talk about autofocus. And the first thing I want to talk about is the massive amount of customization you can do with the autofocus system. When it comes to things like subject detection, for instance, you can actually tell the camera whether you want it to just look for eyes in a face, or look for eyes, face, and body. And that is really great. I have it set for just the eyes and the face because I don't want it going to the body when I'm trying to use subject detection, because a lot of times the body's not on the same focal plane as the face or eye. So usually I want it on the face or the eye, so I've been able to tell the camera to do that. It's been really great. There's also some sub-menu items under each category of subject detection type that the camera has that allows you to further refine how the subject detection performs and how it behaves when you're out in the field. And I'm still kind of tweaking those. Again, I've only been using this camera for a couple of weeks, but I am still kind of diving into there. But there is a lot of options here to really customize this camera and make it behave the way you want from an autofocus and especially from a subject detection standpoint. And I know as wildlife photographers, that's a really big concern for us. And I know a lot of people are also wondering, how does this compare to the autofocus system on the A1? And I've been shooting those cameras side by side a lot of times with the same subject. So I'll be using this camera and then I'll say, oh, I'm going to try this with the A1. I'm going back and forth, same lens, same conditions. Basically what I found is that the A9 Mark III does seem to have an edge over the A1 when it comes to autofocus. I don't know if that's because it's just a more sophisticated system in here, if it's a newer camera or what the deal is, but it does seem to have an edge over the A1. And it's not a huge edge, and the edge seems to vary depending on what you're working on. For example, if I'm working with birds, yes, this has a little bit of an edge over the A1, but it's not night and day. It's only certain circumstances that it seems like maybe the A9 Mark III does have an advantage. One thing I have noticed though with mammals is that when you have the camera set for animals, this one seems to be much more eager to grab onto the eye than the A1 is. And in fact, I've even had it find the eyes of elephants and hippos, not super consistently, but way better than the A1 and way better than any other system I've used up to this point. And when you give it things like gazelle or back in the States, deer, things like that, it just grabs right onto those eyes and holds them really, really well. I also find that it does a really great job with cats and any kind of canine type of thing. And this has been just fantastic. Even baboons does a fantastic job, gets on the eye, stays there. So from that respect, I do think it does have a little bit better AF system than the A1. Again, not night and day. The A1 is still very, very good, but this does seem like it's taken it up a notch. And again, it is so customizable. You can kind of tune it into whatever you want. And one of these days, I will figure out all of these things, and I'll maybe make another video and kind of explain what all of these options are. So make sure you subscribe. So what about that 24 megapixel sensor? Because that is really the hang up that everybody has with the A9 Mark III, right? Because we're all used to shooting 45 or 50 megapixel sensors, and this one is 24. So how is that played out? Well, with this camera, it's a little bit different because most of the time, when you have a 24 megapixel sensor, the advantage to a lower res sensor is that you're trading that extra resolution for speed, which this has in spades. And you also get better low light performance, which this does not. And that's where this gets a little bit dicey. And I'm going to talk about that first, then we'll talk about using 24 megapixel in the real world here. But I've noticed that the ISO is definitely, as reported, a little bit worse than the A1. So if I'm in a low light situation, even if I want the action camera, I find myself reaching for the A1 simply because I want that better noise performance. And to me, that's kind of an Achilles heel to this global sensor in here. I don't mind shooting 24 megapixel, I'm getting speed and low light performance, but I'm only getting speed here. So that's kind of the first thing to think about. And then of course there is the 24 megapixel aspect of it. Now I have shot low resolution sensors for a long, long time. I shot tons of stuff with a D5, D6, and I'm no stranger to these lower resolution sensors. And 24 megapixel, not bad at all as far as I'm concerned. However, it does limit what you can do when it comes to things like cropping. So if you have a subject that's far away, and sometimes we can work on our field craft and we can learn to get a little bit closer, we can use longer glass, things like that, so that we aren't in a situation where we're not able to fill the frame. However, there are times that you just can't help it. We sometimes here in Botswana, we were, photographing birds that are this big. At times you can only get so close to those things, and a croppable camera comes in handy, whereas 24 megapixel, if it's a little bit small in the frame, just isn't getting you there. But still, for the most part, I don't really mind 24 megapixel too much. It's just a matter of making sure that I'm getting close enough to the animal so that I can fill the frame, and using appropriate glass so that I'm filling the frame. A lot of times people become very dependent on cropping. They tend to crop a little looser when they're out in the field so that they can go back and make a final crop at home. And one of the tricks with using a lower resolution sensor like this is to learn to fill the frame and do that in the field and not at home. And that's, just basically developing your field craft. But yes, I will 100% concede there are times that the 50 megapixel A1 has a huge advantage because you just can't get close enough with all the glass that you own. You put the longest thing on here and it's still a little bit too small in the finder. So from that respect, yeah, there is a disadvantage.
Now, another thing I wanted to mention was that base ISO of 250. And I know the argument for this is, you're shooting action, you're probably not going to be at those kind of low ISOs. But in Botswana, that wasn't really the case. And I found, especially if I was shooting my fast lenses wide open because I wanted a creamy background or some subject isolation or whatever, there were a lot of times I was just pegged at the bottom and I had to really watch my shutter speed. I'm very used to using conservative shutter speeds, so I'm constantly kind of cranking that back up. I'm at 1600th of a second at 2.8, and I'm absolutely blowing everything. It's way overexposed. So I had to be very cognizant of what shutter speed I was at and make sure that I was cranking it up as needed if I was in a brighter condition. So you do have to watch that. I really wish this camera had a little bit lower base ISO because it did bite me several times, way more than I had expected, because I was kind of on that same idea that, if you're out there shooting action, you're going to want those real fast shutter speeds anyway, so it doesn't matter. But man, let me tell you, you got to watch that base ISO there of 250. It's a little bit too high in my opinion.
Okay, so the big question then is, where does this camera fit into a wildlife photographer's workflow? And for me, it's kind of a narrow window, and I think it's probably going to be for most people. So basically, when I'm using this camera, comes down to a set of conditions. Basically, I want to be in decent light, I don't want to be in really low light, and I want to be in a situation where I'm more or less filling the frame. I don't have to completely fill the frame. I'm not afraid to crop a little bit on a 24 megapixel sensor, but I certainly don't want to be dealing with a subject that's very, very small in there that's going to take a very heavy crop because you're just not going to have enough pixels. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach for this in those conditions, but if I'm going to need to crop heavy, I'm going to go for an A1. If I'm in low light, I'm going to go for an A1. If I'm shooting non-action, I'm going to go for an A1. I'd like to have those megapixels. So basically this fits into that narrow window where I see a bird that I can fill the frame with relatively well, or a mammal. I was using it with mammals. It was absolutely great chasing lechways as they were leaping in the air and following their eye the whole time. But again, I was within range. I did not have to crop those photos very much or at all, and that's where this camera shines. When you're in decent light and you're not going to be doing much cropping. But any other time, I'm pretty much reaching for that A1. So I think this is a very narrow use for a lot of wildlife photographers. However, if you're a big bird photographer and you love bird in flight and that's all you're doing, and you can usually come pretty close to filling the frame, or you're not cropping too heavily, then this is something that definitely should be on your radar. It is very potent, and when you're using it in its own wheelhouse there, my gosh, it is just absolutely phenomenal. There's nothing better. It does a great job. But when you're out there and you need to do some of those other things, the A1 is the one I turn to. Now, the other thing that I had here, I'm going to talk about just briefly here, is this 300 f2.8. This was a surprise for me, okay? I had to be sort of convinced to buy this. And I finally kind of acquiesced. I've been curious about it. They let me hold it. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so light. It's so nice. And this is super, super hand-holdable, first of all. I mean, this is just, it's a fun lens to shoot, okay? f2.8, when you're within range of a subject at f2.8, the rendering is beautiful. Let me show you a shot here of I got of a vervet monkey, just absolutely gorgeous. I love the rendering of this lens at f2.8, just absolutely beautiful. Super, super sharp. You can see a lot of detail when the lens is absolutely wide open. You don't have to stop down at all. So my field impressions of this have been very, very good. And again, it's not very heavy, it's not very large, very easy to transport. And get this, it takes teleconverters really, really well. So you put a 1.4 on here, you get a 420 f4, nice and sharp. And matter of fact, I cannot really see a difference in sharpness between this bare lens and this lens with a teleconverter for like real world application stuff. You put the 2X on there and it's virtually the same thing. It's very hard to tell that you have the 2x converter on. I do think I'm taking a little bit of a hit with the 2x converter. If I look towards the edges, if I have an animal kind of towards an edge, like a vertical shot or something, maybe it's not quite what I would expect, you know, from just the straight lens, but it is still very, very good. AF speed is maintained very well with the teleconverters, as far as I could tell. Maybe I could do some more formal testing on that later on when I'm not out on safari. But what I can tell, my seat of the pants estimate on the AF speed with this lens is that it's very good, even with teleconverters. So overall, this is a real winner. So one place where I'd really recommend this lens is if you're looking for something that's like more affordable than a 600 f4 or 400 2.8, you want something that's very portable, very compact, and this fits the bill. It doesn't weigh much, it's about 3 pounds. Packs really well into a backpack. Put a small camera on it here, like pretty much everything Sony makes, A9 III or A1, and you have a very versatile set of lenses there. You have the 300, the 420 with the 1.4, and a 600 5.6 with the 2x converter on there. And not taking up a lot of space, you can put it in something that you can tuck under the seat of an airliner, and this works out really, really well. So that's pretty much the video here. And again, I have very positive overall impressions of this, but again, I don't think this A9 Mark III is for everyone, but I think if you do a lot of action wildlife photography, it's definitely something you can consider, especially if you're doing it in halfway decent light. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you check out my educational materials at my site. Lots of stuff, field tested techniques in there to help you get extraordinary photos every time you're out. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.